My name is Dan Michalik. I essentially run research and development for Woolpert, and I'm happy to be here. And today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about geodesign, but within the context of architecture and engineering operations, and specifically at a smaller kind of site scale. I'm going to kind of frame it up within looking at a strategic kind of perspective of geodesign, and then compare that to kind of the tactical operations that AE staff go through, and then try to kind of talk about how to make it work from the practical side. So just two little bits of backstory. I am with Woolpert, which is an architecture, engineering, and geospatial firm. We are AEG, we always have been, we're not an AEC. We are headquartered in Dayton, Ohio. Anybody? You guys learned a lot about Dayton yesterday? I guess I'll just maybe leave it at that. Yeah, Dayton's really not that bad of a place, but we have about 1,000 people that are AE and G professionals, and our footprint here is essentially international. We have probably, I don't know, close to 30 offices across the globe. And the reason why I'm sharing that is because not only do we have a variety of services that we provide, but as is the case with Stantec and others, you're talking about dealing with complicated geographies, a whole different types of clients, project requirements, etc. So, okay, but me, I'm a cartographer by degree and training and background and all that, but I love having architecture and engineering coworkers because they really give me and my other coworkers a front seat to AE operations, right? And I'm not just talking about conversion or like, ETL sorts of tasks where maybe someone gives us shape files we need to put into a GIS utility plan, or maybe takes an as-built and turns it into a digital duplicate, or maybe even something a little more sophisticated like taking massing models and publishing it into a web scene. I'm talking about a first-hand account of the very real push and pull that my AE coworkers deal with on a daily basis to meet project requirements to get things done. And so kind of circling back to the talking points, being a cartographer, I believe that cartography and geodesign are fairly naturally compatible. If we look at the definition of strategic here, I'm not going to read it all, but you're talking about long-term and overall aims and interests to achieve something. And so from my standpoint, we deal in these beautiful image mesh visualizations that I think my coworkers would love to have for planning purposes. Or maybe talking about resiliency. So I'm going to pull public and private dashboards of water monitoring information and maybe climate data to be able to understand sustainability and resiliency for infrastructure operations. Or maybe even on a more of a city level where I might look at, in this example, electrical system performance and condition before I get into a design project just to understand some of those overarching concepts. So those are all great things, right? So it gets me to the tactical side. So I go downstairs where the AE folks are at and I say, hey, let's do this. I mean, we got all this great information. We can really, make a difference here. And they always agree. They're like, I got it. I love it. But let me slow you down and back up for a minute. The nature of my, AE day-to-day tasks is very tactical, meaning that I've got specific things I have to do to meet a specific end. And so it doesn't take much imagination to be able to know what that is, right? If I'm working day-to-day project work as an architect or an engineer, I've got sustainability studies, I've got land use, zoning. Probably the two biggest things are budget and schedule, which are, not always something you can meddle with when it comes to the work that you're doing. And then you start narrowing that down to the site level, and it gets even more challenging for the folks that have to execute those processes. So, in addition, you guys have seen this over the last 2 days in spades, right? You've got a ton of stakeholders, a ton of different drivers. Think about the wide variety of subjects we've covered in, well, not even 2 days really, and change is almost imminent. And so, if I'm an architect or an engineer dealing in this stuff, right, it's very tough for me to keep the strategic aspects of geodesign front and center as I'm dealing with juggling all this stuff. And even if I could do that, I need to make sure that I have access to data that is easily integrated with format, size, level of detail, etc. And the last bullet maybe sounds like a bit of a buzzkill, but a lot of our clients, as enlightened as they are, they get so myopic, right, in what they're looking at, they have a hard time thinking beyond their site only. So, I don't want to be left with the idea of there's nothing we can do, but I feel like after kind of scratching at this itch with our AE coworkers for a couple of years now, to be able to take geodesign concepts that are strategic and make it into something actionable really breaks it down to being practical, right? And it's not to say, we're essentially removing theory and ideas from it. We're not saying they're not important, but we're getting rid of that and we're moving on, right? It's solid concepts. We're going to move on to the actual doing or the use of things to make things happen. So, and that doesn't have to be super fancy, right? It can be, as we've seen, and these are some real project examples, We can pull ArcGIS Online data into Civil 3D, right, so that we can do preliminary studies more successfully. Maybe you have a SCAM to BIM sort of project, and you want to look at it maybe within the context of IoT, asset management, so you have a fuller view of what's going on. Maybe that project comes to fruition, and you put together a dashboard that, in this case, there's I think it's monthly UAS imagery that's captured in the center frame. You've got UAS videos on the lower left, and then time series data on the camera on the right, so that essentially the people working on that project can be nimble and make changes successfully. And another one with some of the indoor stuff. If you do this correctly, you can have you'll be able to consider internal, external, geospatial concerns all together in one visualization for maybe a retrofit sort of project. And then the last one, which is more simple, but it's valid, is even just taking some of these Revit files and publishing them in real-world coordinates so that we have some idea of operations out there. And so those are just practical examples that I know when we do these things, our AE folks really glom onto that because it's something they can actually interact with and use. So we're not trying to do data overload. We're trying to give them actionable, formatted information to make good decisions, right? And I think the one thing we always hear from them is that the perennial challenge is the more meaningful contextual data they can get early in the conceptual design phases, the more successful they will be as a whole. And that's a big crux of it. Even if the project goes well, they're always wanting more data up front. So I think that's a challenge for us to keep up with. And so since we have all these skill sets in-house, and this is just an example, but in 2020 we've put together some investment sorts of R&D pilot projects to try to scope out what that looks like. Since we have all that in-house, how can we workflow it, put it together to be actually practical about considering resiliency within the design of a bridge or something like that. And so these things are just kind of starting, but I would say that even in the basic, even in the initial tenets of looking at these things, there's a few things that really come to bear. There's a ton of potential out there, right? And I really feel like for us as a community, it's time to pivot from potential to action. Such as the first presenter said, one is better than none. It's time to get something going, to be as practical as possible. The second thing, and I mean, digital duplicate's great, don't get me wrong, but if we're really gonna meet the needs of geodesign and those larger concepts, we need to be able to provide architects and engineers and planners with a model of the past, present, and future environmental conditions for reference, which is a heck of a lot harder than publishing a BIM model. Here's these next two subjects or points are probably a little bit too simplistic, but hopefully they resonate. I trust the architects and engineers that we work with. If they can see it with their eyeballs are fantastic at figuring this stuff out. So I feel like we as probably a GIS community can use this sorts of technology to present that to them. Because I know if they see it early on, they'll understand it, they'll react accordingly. But they just don't get all those touch points early on. The second one that I like as well, that maybe is overly simplistic, is the idea that if we do this correctly, we can shape those that shape infrastructure. So if we can actually arm the people that have to actually physically make the city with the data to make intelligent decisions, we can help them in a roundabout way build the environment that we live in, which in an ideal world, grandstanding a little bit, but those designs and visualizations of today will make it back into that system, such that they will be the touch points for future design efforts. And so kind of in closing, some of the things we're focusing on because we kind of can in-house is that idea of really trying to leverage Esri and data interoperability to support comprehensive understanding of data sets that are easy to access as early on in the project process as possible. We want to arm people that don't normally deal in these subjects with information that's easy for them to ingest and visualize, and then kind of be excited about using geodesign to help them better the environment while still staying on schedule and on budget and all those things that they're constantly dealing with. So I'll steal this because everybody else stole it, right, from Ryan. Yeah, I mean, everybody's been talking about data the entire time, right? It's out there, and it's definitely going to change the way we operate. And hopefully that will even happen at a site level where it does get increasingly more complex because of the drivers that folks are dealing with. But I'm optimistic that working together we can make this happen. And I'm hoping that as we continue to push some of these pilot projects, we'll find ways to share some of this information with the larger community to see what works and what doesn't. So with that being said, thanks for your time.